She was 38 years old when the loss of her family's mine claim was taken from her by men who had never once picked up a shovel. Her father had died owing money to a consortium he trusted. Her brother had drowned in a flooded shaft trying to save what little remained. And the man who oversaw the liquidation of everything her family had built, a claims adjuster named Rutherford Combs, saw to it that she walked away with nothing but a small trunk of clothes and $43 in coin. With that money, and nowhere left to go, she bought the old abandoned Assay office on the edge of a played-out mining town called Cinder Gulch, a squat brick building that had sat locked and untouched for nearly 15 years, ever since the man who ran it vanished overnight without explanation. The whole town believed the building was cursed, or worse, that it held some shameful secret nobody wanted uncovered. She bought it for $6 because no one else would touch it. But the heavy iron safe bolted into its back wall was about to tell a story that would change not only her fortune, but the fate of every family whose grandfathers had once panned that dying creek. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Marguerite Colfax. If you've ever been told that a place, or a person, or even you yourself, was too broken or too cursed to be worth anything, tell us where you're watching from in the comments. We think you'll find something of yourself in Marguerite. Marguerite Colfax was born in 1858 in a mining camp in the Sierra foothills of California, the second of 3 children raised by a father who worked a claim with his bare hands and a mother who kept the camp's books with a precision that made grown men blush at their own arithmetic. Her father, Elias Colfax, was not a lucky man in the way luck is usually measured. He never struck it rich, never found a vein that made other men into legends, but he was a patient one, and he taught Marguerite early that gold was not the only thing worth digging for. Numbers. He used to say, "Don't lie the way men do," and a woman who can read a ledger the way a preacher reads scripture will never be at the mercy of anyone's word alone. Her mother, Josephine, had come west from Ohio with an education most camp wives lacked, having been a school teacher before marriage, and she made certain her children could read, write, and cipher long before most families in the Gulch could afford such luxury for their sons, let alone their daughters. It was Josephine who first put a ledger book in Marguerite's small hands, showing her how columns of numbers, when kept honestly, told the truest story of any enterprise, better than any man's promise, better than any rumor passed around a campfire. Marguerite took to it with an intensity that surprised even her mother, spending her evenings not with dolls or needlework but hunched over her father's accounts, checking his sums, learning to spot the small errors that, left unchecked, could sink a family's fortunes. By the time she was 14, she could balance a ledger faster and more accurately than the camp's own bookkeeper, a fact that earned her both quiet pride from her parents and a certain wary suspicion from the men of the camp, who found something unsettling about a girl who understood their finances better than they did. Her father's claim was modest but steady, enough to keep the family fed and clothed, enough to send Marguerite's older brother Thaddeus to a proper school in Sacramento for 2 years before the money ran thin and he returned to work the mine alongside their father. Marguerite herself never had the chance of formal schooling beyond what her mother could teach her, but she read every book that passed through the camp, borrowed and re-borrowed until the spines cracked, and she absorbed her father's particular philosophy of patience the way other girls absorbed their mother's recipes. Elias used to tell her that a mine was not just rock and date, it was a story written in layers, and a man who understood how to read those layers, who paid attention to what the earth was quietly telling him instead of chasing every rumor of a rich strike, would do better in the long run than any man swinging his pick at random. That philosophy served the Colfax family reasonably well for years, through lean seasons and modest ones, until 1876. When Elias, following what he believed was a genuine reading of the rock, sank the family's savings into deepening their shaft along a promising quartz vein. The work was slow and dangerous, and it required capital the family didn't have on hand. So Elias did what many small claim holders did in those years. He took a loan against the claim itself from a consortium of investors out of San Francisco, men who financed dozens of small operations across the Sierra foothills in exchange for a share of whatever was found, with the claim itself as collateral should the venture fail. Marguerite was 18 that year, old enough to understand the weight of what her father had signed, and she remembered asking him, in her careful, ledger-trained way, whether he had read every clause of the contract, whether he understood exactly what would happen if the vein didn't pan out as hoped. Her father, usually so careful, had waved away her concern with the confidence of a man who had spent 30 years reading rock and trusted his own instinct above any lawyer's fine print. It was the one time in her life she watched her father's patience curdle into something closer to pride, and though she said nothing more, she never quite shook the unease that contract left in her. Vein, as it turned out, played out within 18 months, yielding barely enough to cover the cost of extraction, let alone repay the loan against it. By the time Elias understood the full weight of what he'd signed, the consortium had already begun the slow, legal process of calling in their collateral, and there was nothing left to negotiate. Marguerite watched her father age a decade in the span of a single winter, watched the confidence that had once made him seem larger than life shrink into something quiet and apologetic, a man who blamed himself for a mistake that would outlive him. He died in the spring of 1879, officially of a fever that swept the camp that season. Though Marguerite always believed, in the private way children believe things about their parents' deaths, that some part of him had simply given up the fight once he understood what his signature had cost his family. Her mother Josephine did not long survive him, passing the following winter, leaving Marguerite and her younger sister Adelaide in the care of Thaddeus, who at 23 had inherited not only grief but the full weight of a claim now legally entangled with a San Francisco consortium determined to extract every dollar of value the collateral allowed. Thaddeus worked that shaft with a desperation that frightened Marguerite, convinced that if he could just find enough color to satisfy the debt, he could save what remained of their father's legacy. It was that desperation that put him underground during a spring thaw in 1882, when meltwater from the ridge above breached an old timber support and flooded the lower shaft faster than any man could climb free of it. Marguerite was 24 years old when they brought her brother's body up from that mine, and it was in that grief, raw and total, that she first understood how completely her family's story was about to end, not with the drama of a single catastrophic loss, but with a slow, grinding attrition of debts and misfortune that no amount of patience or careful ledger reading could fully outrun. What remained of the claim passed formally into the consortium's hands within the year, overseen by a man named Rutherford Combs, a claims adjuster whose job was to extract whatever residual value existed in failed operations and settle accounts on behalf of investors who had never once set foot in the Sierra foothills. Combs was not a cruel man by any dramatic measure. He did not shout or threaten. He simply operated with the flat, procedural efficiency of a man for whom other people's ruin was a line item to be closed out neatly. He walked the property with Marguerite trailing behind him, watched him catalog what little equipment remained with the same detached thoroughness a mother had once brought to honest bookkeeping, except turned to entirely opposite purpose, extraction rather than preservation. When the settlement was finalized, Marguerite Colfax, now the last of her immediate family still standing, walked away from the only home she had ever known with a small trunk of clothing, her mother's old ledger books which held no monetary value to anyone but her, and $43, the sum total of what remained after the consortium had taken its due. She spent nearly a year afterward doing what many women in her circumstance did, taking in bookkeeping work where she could find it, mending and sewing to fill the gaps, moving from camp to camp as opportunities dried up and rumors of richer strikes pulled the shrinking population of prospectors elsewhere. It was in the autumn of 1883 that she found herself passing through Cinder Gulch, a town that had once boomed alongside a modest but genuine gold strike some 20 years prior and had been slowly emptying out ever since as the surface deposits thinned and the more ambitious prospectors moved on to richer ground further north. What remained was a skeleton of a town, perhaps 200 souls clinging to marginal claims and the businesses that served them, a general store, a church, a saloon that had seen better days, and standing at the edge of it all, a squat brick building with boarded windows that the locals spoke of only in low, uneasy voices. The building, she learned from the woman who ran the boarding house where Marguerite took a cheap room, had once been the town's Assay office, the place where miners brought their ore and dust to be weighed, tested, and certified before selling it onward, an institution as essential to a mining town's daily life as a bank or church. The Assayer, a man named Horace Whitfield, had run the office for nearly a decade, respected by most accounts, trusted with the delicate work of certifying exactly how much a man's hard-won was actually worth, a job that required both technical skill and an unimpeachable reputation for honesty, since a corrupt assayer could quietly cheat an entire town blind, and an inept one could ruin honest men through simple error. Then, one winter night in 1868, Horace Whitfield simply vanished. No note, no warning, no farewell to the wife he'd left behind or the town that had trusted him. The office was locked from the outside, his personal effects mostly still within, and in the 15 years since, no one had summoned the will of funds to do anything with the building beyond letting it sit, boarded and silent, gathering the kind of uneasy local mythology that empty buildings always seem to gather, whispers of foul play, of hidden guilt, of a man who had cheated the town and fled rather than face reckoning. The building belonged, technically, to the county, which had inherited it through a tangle of unpaid taxes and unresolved estate matters no one had ever bothered to sort out properly. And when Marguerite, restless and running low on both funds and prospects, inquired of the county clerk's modest office about the building's status, she found the clerk almost embarrassingly eager to be rid of it. The county would sell it outright, he told her, to anyone willing to take on the tax burden and the trouble. And when she asked the price, expecting some sum well beyond her remaining means, he named a figure so low it took her a moment to understand she'd heard him correctly. $6. $6 for a building the whole town believed was cursed. Or was a building nobody wanted to touch because of what people quietly suspected an honest man had done, or had done to him, within its walls. Marguerite thought of her father's voice, the one that used to tell her a claim was a story written in layers, and something in her, some stubborn residue of the patience he'd taught her even as his own patience had ultimately failed him, made her walk the $6 over to the clerk's office before she fully decided to do it. The clerk seemed almost relieved, handing over a deed with a kind of haste that suggested he feared she might change her mind. When she walked out into the dusty street holding proof that she now owned Cinder Gulch's most notoriously avoided building, she caught the eye of a woman sweeping the boardwalk outside the general store, who looked at her with an expression Marguerite would come to know well over the following weeks, a mixture of pity and superstitious alarm, as though Marguerite had just purchased her own bad luck outright. The building's door had swollen shut with 15 years of weather and neglect, and it took Marguerite the better part of an hour with a borrowed pry bar to work it loose enough to step inside. The air that greeted her was thick and still, undisturbed in a way that made her briefly understand the town's superstition, dust lying so evenly across every surface that it seemed less like neglect and more like preservation, as though the room had been deliberately sealed against time itself rather than simply abandoned. The main room held the remnants of Horace Whitfield's trade, a scarred wooden counter, a set of delicate brass scales still sitting exactly where he'd left them, shelves of small labeled jars and testing equipment gone dull with dust, everything arranged with the careful precision of a man who intended to return the next morning, and had simply, inexplicably, never come back. It was on her second day of clearing the front room, sweeping and cataloguing what remained, that Marguerite noticed a heavy iron safe bolted into the back wall of what had clearly been Whitfield's private office, a small windowless room behind the main counter. The safe was substantial, the kind of fireproof strong-box a serious Assay operation would need to secure certified gold before it was collected for transport, and it sat closed and undisturbed, its dial thick with the same undisturbed dust as everything else in the room. She ran her fingers over its cold iron surface and felt, for reasons she couldn't entirely name, the same steadying instinct her father used to describe when he read a promising layer of rock, a sense that this object had something honest to tell her, if only she was patient enough to find a way in. She spent the better part of a week simply making the building livable, patching the worst gaps in the roof, sweeping 15 years of dust from every corner, sleeping on a cot she'd carried over from the boarding house because she could no longer afford both rent there and the modest cost of restoring what she now owned outright. The town watched her with a wariness that softened only slightly with each passing day. The boarding house woman, whose name was Odalise Pruitt, brought her a warm meal on the third evening with a careful, curious expression of a woman gathering courage to ask a question she'd been holding back, and when she finally asked whether Marguerite wasn't frightened, living alone in the building where Horace Whitfield had disappeared, Marguerite found she could answer honestly that she wasn't, that whatever had happened to Horace Whitfield, the building itself had done nothing but sit patiently, waiting for someone willing to look closely enough to understand it. That safe, however, resisted her patience for longer than she expected. She had no combination, no letter or note indicating one, and though she tried every number that seemed plausible, dates, simple sequences, nothing yielded so much as a shift in the tumblers. It was Odalise, in fact, who unknowingly gave her the key, mentioning almost in passing one evening that Horace Whitfield's wife, a woman named Cornelia, had left Cinder Gulch not long after her husband's disappearance and had gone to live with a sister in Sacramento, and that Cornelia had once, years before any of this happened, taught Sunday school at the small church down the road. A detail that struck Marguerite as insignificant until she recalled examining Whitfield's remaining papers in his office, a small leather-bound Bible tucked into a desk drawer, inscribed on its flyleaf with a date, a scripture verse, and Cornelia's maiden name. It took her another 2 evenings of careful trial, working through the numbers embedded in that inscription, the verse number, the date rendered various ways, before the tumblers finally gave way beneath her patient hands, and the heavy door swung open with a groan of hinges that hadn't moved in 15 years. What she found inside was not, as the whole town had quietly speculated for a decade and a half, evidence of theft or embezzlement or some shameful crime that had driven an honest man to flee in the night. What she found was considerably stranger and considerably sadder. The safe held a modest quantity of certified gold dust, sealed in the small labeled pouches Whitfield had used for his official assays, along with a thick ledger bound in the same careful hand her own mother might have kept, and beneath both of these, wrapped in oilcloth, a stack of letters and a folded document bearing the seal of the Territorial Mining Authority. The ledger told a story Marguerite pieced together slowly, over several days of careful reading, cross-referencing names against a second, smaller book she found tucked behind it, a private record Whitfield had apparently kept separately from his official one. For nearly 2 years before his disappearance, Horace Whitfield had grown increasingly certain that the mining consortium supplying capital to several of the larger claims around Cinder Gulch, a company operating under the name Sierra Extraction and Trust, was systematically underreporting the assayed value of what coming through his office on those particular claims, pressuring or bribing a previous assistant assayer to falsify weights before Whitfield had taken over the position and cleaned house. But the falsified records themselves had never been corrected, meaning dozens of small claim holders across the district had been paid out for years based on assayed values that undervalued their gold by a significant margin, with a difference quietly pocketed by the consortium's local agents before they ever reached legitimate buyers. Whitfield's private ledger catalogued the discrepancy claim by claim, name by name, a meticulous record of exactly how much each family had been shorted over the years, along with copies of letters he had written to the Territorial Mining Authority requesting a formal investigation, letters that, based on the responses folded alongside them, had been met with bureaucratic delay and quiet discouragement. The Territorial Office apparently reluctant to challenge a consortium with significant political connections in the capital. The final letter in the stack, dated only weeks before Whitfield's disappearance, was from the Territorial Authority itself, informing him that his allegations, while noted, would not be pursued without additional evidence, and included, tucked almost as an afterthought, a veiled suggestion that continuing to press the matter publicly might not serve his professional interests, nor his family's well-being. Marguerite sat with that letter for a long while, understanding at last why Horace Whitfield had sealed his findings into that safe rather than simply burning them or walking away entirely, and understanding, too, with a chill that settled slow and certain in her chest, that a man who had gathered proof of a powerful consortium fraud, and who had just been quietly warned to abandon the matter, might not have vanished by his own choice at all. The town's 15 years of whispered suspicion, it seemed, had been aimed in entirely the wrong direction. Horace Whitfield had not fled in guilt. He had disappeared because he refused to stay silent about a wrong being done to his neighbors, and Cinder Gulch, in its uncertainty, had spent a decade and a half quietly blaming the very man who had tried to protect it. Word of what Marguerite had found inside the old Assay office safe did not stay contained for long in a town as small as Cinder Gulch, and within a week, she found herself receiving a visit from a man named Alistair Grieve, who introduced himself as a regional representative for Sierra Extraction and Trust, the very consortium named throughout Whitfield's private ledger. Grieve was polished in a way that stood out sharply against the weathered practicality of Cinder Gulch, his coat well-tailored, his manner warm in a particular, calculated way of a man accustomed to smoothing over difficulties with charm rather than honesty. He had heard, he told her, that she'd found some old papers belonging to the former assayer, and he wanted to assure her that whatever confusion those papers might suggest, the consortium had always operated with complete integrity, and that old, unverified allegations from a man who had, after all, simply disappeared without explanation, hardly constituted reliable evidence of anything. Marguerite, who had spent her entire life reading numbers of the truth they told regardless of what anyone wanted them to say, found Grieve's practiced reassurance did nothing to soften what the ledger's careful columns had already shown her plainly. She told him, with the same calm directness her mother had once brought to an honest balance sheet, that she intended to bring Whitfield's record to the Territorial Authority herself, along with the names of every family shorted, and that she would welcome the consortium's cooperation in making those families whole, but that she would proceed with or without it. Grieve's charm cooled considerably at that, and over the following days he tried several approaches in succession. First, a generous offer to purchase the Assay office and all its contents outright, well above any reasonable value, an offer Marguerite recognized immediately as an attempt to make the evidence simply disappear a second time. When she declined, he shifted to a quieter form of pressure, reminding her that a woman alone, new to a town still uncertain about her, might find life considerably harder if she made enemies of the region's most significant employer, a veiled warning that echoed uncomfortably with the one Whitfield himself had received 15 years before. It was that echo, more than anything else, that hardened Marguerite's resolve entirely, because she understood now with total clarity that she was not simply uncovering an old financial discrepancy, she was picking up a fight that had already cost one honest man everything, and she intended to finish what he had started. She spent the following weeks doing the patient, unglamorous work her mother had trained her for since childhood, cross-referencing every name in Whitfield's private ledger against the family still living in and around Cinder Gulch, discovering that many of them, including several who had left claims decades ago and moved on to other towns, could still be located through old church records and county filings. She wrote to the Territorial Mining Authority herself, not with vague allegations but with Whitfield's meticulous documentation attached in full, copied in her own careful hand to preserve the originals, and she made a point of also writing to a newspaper editor in the territorial capital whose name she recognized from an old article about mining fraud, understanding that public attention, unlike quiet bureaucratic correspondence, was harder for a powerful consortium to simply wait out. The response, when it came, arrived not from the territorial authority directly, but in the form of a formal investigator, a careful, unhurried man named Josiah Kettleman, who spent nearly 2 weeks in Cinder Gulch interviewing claim holders, examining Whitfield's ledger against surviving consortium records, and slowly building a case that corroborated, point by point, exactly what the vanished Assay had tried to report 15 years before. Kettleman's inquiry also, almost incidentally, turned up something Marguerite had not anticipated, a records clerk in the territorial capital who remembered, from years before, a quiet payment made to discourage a formal investigation into Assay fraud around Cinder Gulch, a payment traceable through a paper trail Sierra Extraction and Trust had not been careful enough to fully erase, directly to a mid-level territorial official who had conveniently retired from public service not long after Whitfield's disappearance. What became of Horace Whitfield himself, Marguerite never fully learned, and neither did the investigation, though Kettleman's inquiries did eventually turn up an old, unmarked burial recorded in a neighboring county's coroner record from that same winter, a man of roughly Whitfield's description found along a remote stretch of road, never identified, buried without ceremony under a marker that read only unknown traveler. Marguerite chose to see to it that the marker was eventually replaced, quietly, with Horace Whitfield's actual name, a small act of restoration that felt, to her, like the very least a town owed a man who had tried to protect it and paid the ultimate price for his honesty. Alistair Grieve did not remain in his position, long once Kettleman's findings became formal. Sierra Extraction and Trust, unwilling to have its name further tangled in a fraud investigation that was drawing regional newspaper attention, quietly removed him and several other regional agents implicated in the discrepancy, and though no one involved ever faced a full weight of criminal prosecution, for the same reason such matters so often escape consequence in territories more concerned with commerce than justice, the consortium was compelled, under threat of losing its territorial mining license entirely, to establish a restitution fund to compensate every family Whitfield's ledger had documented as shorted, with interest calculated back to the original date of each fraudulent assay. It was Marguerite herself, given her intimate knowledge of the ledger and her natural gift for the work her mother had first taught her, who was asked to help administer that restitution, traveling when necessary to locate families who had long since moved on, verifying claims against Whitfield's careful records, ensuring that the money reached the people it was actually owed to rather than disappearing into further bureaucratic delay. She watched an elderly widow in a neighboring county weep over a sum that finally let her repair a roof she'd been patching with canvas for a decade. She watched a family who had given up mining entirely and moved to farming instead receive enough restitution to finally clear the debt on their land outright. Each name in that ledger, once just careful ink on a page, became a face, a story, a small piece of justice finally arriving 15 years later than it should have, with what remained of her own modest share awarded to her both for the discovery and for her work administering the fund. Marguerite did not leave Cinder Gulch, as many might have expected, for somewhere with brighter prospects. Instead, she restored the old Assay office fully, repaired its roof and its boarded windows, cleaned and repaired Horace Whitfield's old brass scales, and reopened it, This time not merely as an Assay office, but as the closest thing the district had to an honest, independent accounting office, a place where small claim holders could bring their ledgers and their or both, confident that whoever examined them would tell them the truth regardless of what any consortium preferred to hear. She kept the safe, repaired and functioning, in the back office exactly where Whitfield had left it, and she had a small brass plate fixed above it, engraved simply with his name and the words, "He told the truth when it cost him everything." Marguerite Colfax had walked into Cinder Gulch with $43, a small trunk, and her mother's old ledgers, the last remnants of a family that patient honesty alone had not been enough to save from ruin. She had bought, for $6, a building the whole town believed was cursed, haunted by a shameful secret nobody wanted uncovered. What she found instead, sealed inside that iron safe, was not shame at all but its opposite, proof of a man's quiet, costly integrity, and a chance, 15 years delayed, to finish the work he had died trying to do. She thought often, in the months that followed, of her father's voice telling her that a mind was a story written in layers, that patience and careful attention would always reveal more truth than any rumor whispered around a campfire. Cinder Gulch had spent 15 years reading Horace Whitfield's disappearance as a mystery of guilt. It had taken a woman with nothing left to lose, and everything to gain from looking closely rather than believing the easy story, to read those layers correctly at last. She had come seeking nothing more than a cheap roof over her head, and had found, instead, a way to finally close the account her own family's honest ruin had left unsettled in her heart, restoring not her own fortune first, but a whole community's long-buried truth, and in doing so, restoring something in herself that 6 years of loss had nearly convinced her was gone for good. Thank you for spending this time with Marguerite's story and with us. If it stayed with you, we'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who needs a reminder that patience and honesty still matter, even when the world seems determined to reward neither. We'd love to hear from you in the comments. Tell us about a time you found real value, or real truth, in something everyone else had already written off as worthless or cursed. Until next time, stay close.